pressure here. Thank you. Lost my talk. I don't know where it went. Anyway, I want to thank you guys. I am so deeply honored to be here tonight. I apologize. I'm very sorry about the seating thing earlier. My mind is blown of how many of you came out tonight. I want to thank Amanda Berry for the very kind introduction, and I want to thank the entire Associated Student Academic Affairs Board for having me here. Thanks to all of you for nominating me. I'll say more about that grievous mistake later. I appreciate especially your coming here tonight, especially since Grey's Anatomy starts at 9. My goal is to get you out of here by 9. I know a lot of you wonder if Chang and Owen are going to split now. I don't know if we'll be out by 9 now, but we'll see. I want to thank my brilliant and beautiful wife, Dr. Amy Jaffe, for being here. And for always being here. My son Jason is down at UCLA studying for an exam. At least he's supposed to be. When Amanda wrote me 2 weeks ago, I told her that of course I would accept her invitation, that I was honored beyond words. And that's how I was for an entire week, beyond words. I lecture twice a week, in Campbell Hall to 750 students, and I love every minute, but this lecture left me terrified and stuck with total writer's block. Amanda told me that I could speak about anything I wanted for as long as I wanted. The talk should be in the style of Randy Pausch's last lecture, that I should contemplate my own death, and that hopefully I would have something inspiring to say along the way. Well, this was a tall order, because Randy Pausch is a hard act to follow. Some of you may know his story. Well, I wanted to thank you. There's the thank you slide. Well, here's Randy Pausch. Randy Pausch was a computer science professor at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. He was just 46 years old with a happy marriage and 3 young children when he found out that he had pancreatic cancer, the type that's incurable and kills almost everyone within 2 years. Last lectures are a long academic tradition, usually given when professors retire. But for Randy Pausch, he meant this to be his real last lecture. He called it Really Achieving Your Childhood Dreams. And it was chock full of humor and stories and wise sayings. His talk went viral on YouTube. He represented it on Oprah. The book based on it became a bestseller. He made no secret of his love for Star Trek, and so J.J. Abrams cast him in a cameo role in the 2008 remake of Star Trek. Despite an incredibly supportive family and community, as well as first-class medical care, Randy Pausch died in July 2008, but not before he inspired millions with his message. And I am supposed to follow this. Well, after some thought, I figured out that there were 2 facts that made this lecture awkward. Well, first, I'm not dying. The people who witnessed Randy Pausch's last lecture knew his days were numbered. He'd been ill for a year. And right after his lecture, numerous people arose to praise his courage and to announce a scholarship in his honor. Second, I'm not even retiring. I plan to be back on campus Tuesday, teaching class and responding to a slew of emails that have gone unanswered because I've been frozen with writer's block. But then a thought surfaced that pops up all the time, honestly, but I usually push it to the side. And you can guess what that thought might be. That one of these is false. And guess which one it is? Of course, it's the first one. I am dying. It's not a particularly heavy metaphysical concept. It's nothing original. We all start dying. The day we're conceived, the moment we're conceived. Life's a one-way trip with no return ticket. But this fact becomes more real at some point in everyone's life. Sometimes it first hits home when a parent dies. As kids, we often think of our parents as ageless and just there, like the furniture. As adolescents, we sometimes wish they were dead, but we're just really kidding, kind of. Some of you may have lost a parent when you were very young, in which case death becomes all too real, all too early, and it's too much to handle. I lost my dad in my late 20s. I was in graduate school being workaholic, as are all graduate students. I know a few of you are here tonight. He had been ill for a week in the hospital with congestive heart failure. He was halfway across the country, and I could barely afford the trip. I kept putting it off, maybe because I thought I might be putting off his death as well. Then the nurse reached me late one night and said, "If you want to see your father, you'd better come now." I took the next red-eye flight, and I saw him that morning. I went right to the hospital. My dad was totally lucid. He told me how much he loved me, how proud he was of me. He asked me what I was doing. I told him, much as I could. I told him how much I loved him, again and again. He died at 3 a.m. that night. The nurses said he was waiting to see me before he died. For years, I missed him every day. The books have been written about the special bonds between fathers and sons. I didn't know then how to put it into words, but I was different after he died. For a month or two afterward, there would be times when a deep sadness would well up unexpectedly, but also a sense of peace. I never felt so alone in the world after he died, but I felt stronger, as though he'd given me his strength as he passed away. I think about this every day when I'm with Jason, and I hope he can draw some strength from me when my time comes. My next rude awakening about my own death came when I turned 40. As silly as this sounds, it just dawned on me to do the arithmetic. And I simply figured that I might have fewer years left than I'd already lived. I panicked because I began to feel time running out for the very first time. When I went to the doctor for an annual checkup, and at a certain age you start having to get those, I'd say to myself, you only have maybe 35 or 40 of these checkups left. And I started to tick them off. I buy a new car every 10 years or so. So I figured I'd have 3, maybe 4 more cars left in my life. My mom died only 2 years ago after a long battle with cancer. I want to tell you about her later, because she taught me the most about dying. In fact, she blew away all my preconceptions about what a dying person should be like. But you begin to be aware that your time will come too, and the whole Mufasa, Simba, circle of life business becomes more than just a syrupy Disney song. I asked myself, what is this last lecture for? And I realized this was why I had been so frozen with writer's block. I asked myself, what could I say? What could I possibly do with this privilege? Yeah, but also tremendous responsibility. So what is this last lecture for? The first thing I did that broke my writer's block was to think about why I accepted the invitation in the first place. I've thought about little else but this talk in the past 2 weeks. My stack of emails will tell you that. I realized that the reason I accepted had everything to do with the realization that time was short, and that maybe I could save you some time. See, I could save you some time by helping you avoid some of the blind alleys that I took, that the people I know took, that the people of my generation took. I think this is one reason why us grown-ups want to give inspiring talks to you. We want you to see what we didn't. We want you to take advantage of what we couldn't. We want to save you in ways that we were unable to save ourselves. To save you a little precious time, to save you a little pain. And because of this, possibly to help you give your children a world that's a little better than the one we've given you. So that's why I accepted Amanda's invitation. So to get over one other thing, I had to get over one other thing before I could start writing, and that is, why me? I really took this one seriously. Why should I give the last lecture? I mean, you really could have had a Nobel laureate, for crying out loud. I decided that you all did make a big mistake. But under the circumstances, the gracious thing to do was to overlook your error. But then I thought, you know, if the goal of the last lecture is to give you some advice and inspiration and save you from a little pain, maybe I did have some small something to say. You know, I trained as both a research and clinical psychologist, and for 30 years I've led a dual life. On campus I do laboratory research and I teach psychological science, and I have to see the world in a very precise and analytical way. But for 30 years I've also seen patients in therapy, and in that role people share the conflicts and secrets and pain and guilt and anguish that they never have told anybody else. When I began, I dealt with each role as a separate compartment. As I get older, each one has helped me better understand the other. So what I hope to convey to you today is some advice and some stories and some experience. It's a mixture of a little science, a little clinical wisdom. I say that I offer it to you, and I do. But I also have my son on my mind. Jason is your age, and I wrote this for both him and for you. The more I thought, the more several themes began to gel. And as UC students coping with the budget cuts and the tuition increases, the first one should really hit home. And it's this: it does get better. If I were starting this lecture like the people who give high school graduation speeches, I would say something like, we proudly pass the torch to you, the next generation. To show you how old I am, I graduated high school in 1968, when Lyndon Johnson was president. College students were being drafted to go to Vietnam. There were no PCs or cell phones, and we played Bob Dylan on the Beatles, and the Beatles on these things called records. The speaker at our graduation was a member of the so-called greatest generation that was so victorious in World War II. He was proud to hand over the torch, and we were proud to receive it. If he was a member of the greatest generation, then I am a member of the lamest generation. The torch we are passing to you is soaked in massive greed, debt, and corruption. The U.S. is now $15 trillion in debt, more than any nation in history. Our so-called leaders were too tin-eared to heed the warnings, and they remain too timid to pull us back from the brink. The times are tough. I'm guessing that many of you are feeling the impact. Many of you are working multiple jobs or taking out big loans to help with your tuition. Many of you have been shut out of classes because of the university budget cuts. And I hear so many stories about parents laid off, houses foreclosed upon, people dropped from classes due to unpaid bills. There are people who aren't here because they had to drop out of school entirely. But I'm here to tell you that we have been in this place before, and it will get better. The economy will resurge, it always does. And with the education you will receive here, you will be in the best possible position to succeed personally and to contribute socially. How can you put yourself in the best position to thrive and succeed? Randy Pausch's last lecture was about achieving your childhood dreams. He gave his talk a year before the financial crash in 2008 that led us to this great recession. These days, I believe that many people are thinking less about achieving their childhood dreams than about surviving day to day. But even in these tough times, you can exert your power in the world, knowing that things will get better. I have a few suggestions. One is to occupy your life. One of the famous quotes from Randy Pausch's talk was, "We cannot change the cards we are dealt, just how we play the hand." I want to agree with him and go even one step further. At this university, like most others, I suspect you have taken many courses where the focus has been on inequalities. You have been taught about racial inequalities. You have been taught about sexual inequalities. And you are being taught about economic inequalities. I suspect that you have been outraged, as I have, by the injustices that have occurred throughout history. You have also been taught that these inequities persist, and that if you are in a minority, that you will inevitably be a victim of them. Thus, if you are African American, the system is rigged against you. If you are a woman, the system is rigged against you. If you are gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgendered, then the system is rigged against you. If you are in the 99%, then the system is rigged against you. You are told that the system needs to change so that justice is restored and you get what is rightfully yours. You are told that other people need to give their fair share so that you can get a fair shake. I bet that each one of you can think of a way in which you have been treated unfairly and feel like you are owed. But I want to give you some advice now that you may find unconventional. In psychology, there's this thing called the just world hypothesis. Some of you may have heard of it. It's this belief we are all prone to, that people usually get what they deserve. It's, of course, a big fat defense mechanism, because we know that this isn't true. Sometimes the best people die young. Crooks win elections. Bank robbers make off with millions. Lying, abusive parents get custody of their kids. And child murderers are found not guilty at trial. We are left to take heart when justice prevails and despair when it doesn't. Here's what I'm getting at. I'm suggesting that you embrace the unfairness of the world. The world has always been unfair. The world will always be unfair. I ask you to accept it, and I ask you to embrace it. I want to ask you to do something that may go against every cell in your body. I am asking that you give up, completely give up, your idea of a just world. I am asking that you accept that the world has always been unfair and will always be unfair. And if you get down to it, if you ask people what fair is, you would get a million different answers anyway. But we don't have to figure out what's fair or even try. Here's what I mean. Instead of saying, I am in the 99%, or gay, or a woman, or in a racial minority, and so the system is rigged against me, I want you to pretend that it isn't. I want you to hold your head high and pretend that the system will treat you fairly. This is what I mean by embracing the unfairness of the world. When you realize that the world will always be unfair, then you won't spend your time complaining that the world is unfair. You won't wait for Judgment Day to give you what's yours. Instead, you go out and get what you want. You spend your time finding your way in the world. You take the knocks, you play the odds. You ask for a helping hand until one day you get your lucky break. Women broke into the boardroom and the operating room, one woman at a time. African Americans became successful businessmen and cabinet members, and Supreme Court justices and eventually president, one at a time. Regard yourself as the prime mover of your own fate. Occupy your life. Do you see how this works? When you get where you want to grow, when you get where you want to go, you'll be in a position to help others. That's how you will change the world. That's how you will correct injustice. Go for it. And I want you to enjoy the journey as you go for it. You are here at UCSB because you are high achievers, all of you. In high school, many of you had your focus on sky-high GPAs and on chalking your resumes and personal statements full of clubs and extracurriculars and community service. In college, many of you are thinking about the shrinking job market and are again laser focused on your GPA, your resume, getting those recommendation letters, and maybe taking prep courses for those GREs and MCATs and LSATs. Do you think the competitive pressures ever end? Once you get a job, you will worry about raises and promotions and the person down the hall who seems to be spending a lot of time after work with the manager. Then there's that higher status firm in Boston, or maybe becoming the manager of your own division. Now you might think there's a top job where you'd sit pretty and never worry. For example, imagine being a neurosurgeon. Many people imagine it to be the quintessential, enviable, high status job. I mean, look at Derek Shepard. Yes. It's glamorous to be a neurosurgeon, and yes, it's at the top of the medical hierarchy, and yes, you can still earn a lot doing it. And once you become a neurosurgeon, this glamorous top-of-the-heap profession, do you think, I've achieved the pinnacle of my profession, now I can relax and feel good about myself? Far from it. Soon you start comparing yourself only with your fellow neurosurgeons. You find that you're the only neurosurgeon who hasn't yet been president of the County Neurosurgical Society. And every other neurosurgeon has privileges at 5 hospitals compared to your 4, and your office partner has been elected Physician of the Year and you weren't even nominated. And the beat goes on. How can any of us come to deal with this achievement treadmill? Seeing patients and their families over the years, I've met people who were both rich and poor, who had undistinguished lives by the usual criteria, and others who were distinguished and celebrated. I've been with many of them on their deathbeds when they contemplate their lives, and they have taught me something that has changed me. Without exception, it's not the honors they've racked up that they talk about. Instead, it's the things that seem very ordinary. A man who was a king of high finance told me about how he always enjoyed hikes in the woods. A dentist who had a vanity practice on Central Park South in Manhattan talked about reading poetry with his late wife over the 60 years of their marriage. A Benedictine monk who studied philosophy at Oxford and Cambridge and is a widely respected theologian who ascended to the highest levels at the Vatican, remembered listening to the opera on the radio as a child with his mother. A neuroscientist remembered fondly arriving at his first job in a science lab and going out for beer every night with his lab partners and talking about what neat stuff they'd done that day. A World War II hero who planted the American flag at Casablanca during the North African invasion most loved talking about taking his sweetheart to ballroom dances just after the war. Never did they mention the Best Regional Sales Award, or having an income exceeding 6 figures, or being able to afford the biggest house in town, or meeting the Pope, or earning a Purple Heart. These people taught me, and what I pass on to you, is that life is not a contest where the goal is to collect the most prizes before you die. Now, there's nothing wrong with achievement. In fact, achievement is great. But the way to think of achievement is as a spin-off of a process that you enjoy, not the distant target of grim determination. George Bernard Shaw once said, "There are 2 great tragedies in life: One is not to get your heart's desire, and the other is to get it. People often dream of winning the lottery, but then they find that their problems multiply with their income. The dream job often turns out to be a nightmare. We never know. That's why we have to love the path and not the destination. If you win a sales prize, it should be because you love selling. If you win a Pulitzer Prize, it should be because you love journalism and not because you love because you covet a Pulitzer. Now let's go back a minute to the neurosurgeon. Being a neurosurgeon, what does that mean? It means standing behind a surgical microscope on 6 to 8 hour surgeries, working with patients you have only an hour's contact with before and after surgery. It means grueling nights on call. It means hours and hours of dictating surgical reports. And it means battles with insurance companies after you're not paid. They don't show Derek Shepherd doing any of this. Will it fill your heart day after day? If you have the calling, it will. It's possible, as some people believe, that most of you will not have single careers. If the life expectancy forecasts are any guide, you'll probably live an average of 90 years each, and maybe 50 or 60 of those will be working years. You can expect to have multiple job titles and work for yourself or for multiple companies or government agencies. This may seem a little scary, but potentially it's very exciting, because you will have the chance to reinvent yourself and try new things as the world changes. You may discover new interests, and as many people are already doing, you will carve out your own jobs based on your unique blend of talents. Here's the take-home message. Stop asking yourself, what do I want to be? Ask yourself, what do I want to do every day? That means finding the path that you love traveling. And on that path, be vulnerable. I wouldn't be surprised if all the talk about the future has brought up for you a lot of anxiety. I know thinking about the future drove me crazy when I was in college. I had changed majors 2 or 3 times when I was in college, and I didn't really have any idea what I wanted to do until after I left college. I also remember that I was either too proud or too ashamed to admit how lost I was during those years. It seemed like all my friends had clear plans for their lives, and I wasn't about to let them know that I didn't have it all worked out for myself. I can only guess what some of you are going through as you think about your futures. UCSB has a reputation as being full of good-looking, partying, carefree students at a campus on the beach in Southern California. It's hard to imagine a more idyllic scene or more idyllic lives from a distance. But scratch the surface and you inevitably find human beings with lives no better or worse than anyone else's. This hit home to me about 5 years ago when I was invited to speak by the members of one of the sororities on campus here. They asked me to come talk about mental health issues, but the discussion quickly turned to things like dieting and bulimia. Because you see, looking good takes effort. And maintaining your weight in a world of pizza and beer causes many to have daily internal struggles with food, an obsession with body image, and for some people, eating disorders. Several of these women describe their battles with food and weight and appearance, and most of the women in the room admitted to at least one part of their body that they absolutely hated and made them conscious about how they looked all the time. If you passed these people on campus, you might think they had everything going for them. Once you talked with them, you realized they had problems too. For a few weeks afterward, I was visited by some of the sisters in the house who wanted advice about their depressed mothers or their alcoholic fathers or their autistic little brothers. This is the tip of the iceberg. Every year I teach some 2,000 undergraduates. Some of what I teach involves issues like depression, anxiety, ADHD, OCD, alcoholism, and drug use, as well as eating disorders. And every year, dozens and dozens of students come to me and share with me problems they've never told anyone before, or they discuss problems with a suicidal roommate or an abusive partner or a bipolar family member. I always try to help them make sense of what they're experiencing, and I try to help them find help if they want it. No one is immune to the human condition. All of us at some point in our lives feel overcome by what life hands us. And if we have worn a shield of perfection and cool and invulnerability, at some point we all have to drop it. The sorority members who invited me and the students over the years who have come to me or who went to their friends or other support people at UCSB showed courage by exposing vulnerability and declaring that even at the supposed playground of UCSB, you are, like all of us, imperfect and have problems and at times can use help. There is power in vulnerability because it allows us to heal and it gives us the strength to change our situations for the better. Every one of us has baggage. Every one of us has issues, and no one is free of sin. My hope is that you find people with whom you can be vulnerable, with whom you can ask for help, and with whom you can develop long, nourishing relationships. Now, I want to turn to these relationships and why they are so important. And I want to suggest how important it is to make real connections while you're here. Earlier, I talked about the importance of enjoying the journey when you think about your work. If achievement for achievement's sake will leave you empty, what is guaranteed to fill you? For most of us, it's the connections we make with others. We're social beings, and loneliness doesn't suit us well. For many people, the connections you make here at UCSB will be lifelong. The power of connection with others is in the vulnerability I mentioned, in the validation and support we give each other in the face of hardship. True friends do fun things with us and celebrate our happy moments with us. But they also bring us medicine when we're sick. They visit us if we have to go to the hospital. They give us hugs and kind words when we're down, and they stick with us in our foul moods. If the feelings run deeper, then there is passion and tenderness and closeness. Relationships in psychology are known as stress buffers, which make them sound like Rolaids. But it shows just how important they are. Now, it's not just any relationships that are stress buffering. It's the ones that build over time, that deepen over time, that get tested and strengthened over time. And here's where I ask you not to confuse real relationships with e-relationships, or do I say it, I-relationships. I'll never forget the story back in 1994 that singer and drummer Phil Collins divorced his wife by fax. But today people routinely break up by text. Who knew that today, just 18 years later on Facebook, you could completely unfriend somebody with one mouse click? Relationship statuses on Facebook change like the weather. People's pages refer to other people's hookups, breakups, and screw-ups. And reputations get trashed with anonymity and no accountability. What the old courtship system had going for it was built-in frustration. People had to prove their worthiness to their partners over time, over the long haul. In the process, they got to know each other over time. Sometimes I get to speak to couples who've been happily married for 30, 40, and even 50 years. They still have a twinkle in their eye when they speak to each other. They tell stories about how they met and how they courted. They're stories of lingering glances, long, heartfelt talks, small, heartfelt gifts, spending holidays together, slow dances in the moonlight. These days, people don't date, they hook up. One-night stands have become inconsequential distractions. arranged by text messages, party meetups, or Craigslist. In IV, the hungover walks home on Saturday and Sunday mornings in day-old clothes look like the zombie apocalypse. Love letters have been replaced by SMSs, and poetic sentiments have become smiley faces and acronyms like OMFG, that was F starring GR number 8. Nowadays, sexual experiences are freely given and gotten, and like all discount goods, they are not treasured as much as those that are hard won. What gets sacrificed is depth, intimacy, meaning, and the chance to share paths as your lives develop. That most sex happens in the context of binge alcohol and drug intoxication speaks to the senselessness, boredom, and isolation behind it all. The last thing I'm suggesting is a return to Victorian repression. Believe me. What I'm suggesting is that you place a priority on finding your path, on finding what is meaningful to you, and on building your relationships on that. This is extra important because, as many of you know from your psych classes, we don't have an internal moral compass that guides us. We're like sponges. We form our values from the people around us. You'll become ethical, loving, trustworthy people only if you pick those kinds of people as your partners and your friends. So pick them wisely. Soon you'll become like them. With luck, you'll have them for years, even a lifetime. You'll form your histories together. You'll be able to understand each other deeply. You'll be able to help each other in ways that no number of hit-and-run relationships ever will. Death brings meaning to life. When I thought about the connections that have meant the most to me, I did something to myself that I and other therapists sometimes ask of their patients, and I would ask you to do the same. Imagine that you are on your own deathbeds. With whom do you think the most fondly about? With whom do you share the deepest connections? What are the memories with them that you would most treasure? For me, there was one lady when I was a child, an across the street neighbor who let me cry on her shoulder one time when I was in middle school, when I thought that my life was falling apart, and she didn't tell my parents. There were a few high school teachers who took extra time with me after school and encouraged me to go to college. There was a professor in college who thought I had potential and took me under his wing. And then there was a woman who thought I had potential and decided to marry me. An obvious failure of judgment. Amy and I have been married for 25 years. And she has taught me many things during that time. Her love healed much of the pain I'd carried, and that we all carry from the relationships that didn't work out. When I met her, I was a total workaholic. She taught me the importance of balance, and that relationships have to be nourished just like careers. This balance has to be fought for constantly. Sometimes the pressures of work crowd out the relationship. At other times, relationships or family issues crowd out everything else, and you vow to rebalance your life when life allows. On my deathbed, my most life-changing connection would be with my son. Jason was born 20 years ago this March. A wise man once said that we re-experience our own childhood through our children's eyes. And Jason's birth was my rebirth. I began giggling again. He and I played nonstop tickle games. I found out that I was great at baby talk. and at composing silly songs, and at changing diapers. I looked forward to watching Barney the dinosaur with him on TV every morning. The same shows over and over. When Jason was 2, I took him to every construction site in Ventura County so that we could watch the bulldozers and the backhoes and the auger drills. When he was 5, we took him to the Main Street Electrical Parade at Disneyland, and he and I shared a total euphoric trance. When he was 10, I remember helping him tie his necktie. And I remember him saying, "Dad, you're not crying, are you?" And I was. Amy had been telling me not to be so much of a workaholic, and I was finally getting the message because the simple joys of being a family were just so much more fun. I have a friend in the psychology department who shared a similar message. He has older sons now. He said that whenever he sees his sons, the thing they always remind him about is that when they were in school, he never missed any of their soccer games. That, and not his list of publications, is what he's proudest of. I guarantee you that's what he'll remember on his deathbed. Part of any last lecture is pondering your own death. And as I mentioned, my age and my parents' deaths made it all too real. But everyone also thinks about what happens at the moment of death and afterward. I want to speak to you intellectually about death for a minute, and then I'll get more personal about it. The older I get, the more I think we all need answers to the ultimate questions. Why are we here? Where did the universe come from? Is the universe infinite? What happens after death? I think the reason is because we're wired to hate unfinished business and unanswered questions. Let me see if I can play this. Here we go. That was, okay, there you go. It drives you mad. When I play that without the last 2 notes, you are compelled to finish the last 2 in your brain. Shall I do it one more time? Just for effect, just to drive you crazy. Here we go. Thank you so much, I appreciate that. Those are my 2 lab assistants there. Thank you so much. Here, let's finish it. Okay, now order is restored in the world. All our questions are answered. I think we're wired to hate unfinished questions, unanswered questions, unfinished business. We hate hearing the first 5 notes without the last 2. We can't think about anything else. This is a long, long known psychological phenomenon, and I think the ultimate questions are just like this. We can't stand not to have answers, any answers, because otherwise we just can't go on. That's where faith comes in, because otherwise there are no answers. Many people put their faith in religion. Often it's out of fear if they don't. And people often do backbends to justify their faiths. They weep at the miracle of the infant who survives a plane crash, but they don't question the God who caused the crash in the first place. Other people put their faith in science, if you'll excuse the expression. I do, because it's the only belief system that contains a built-in method of self-correction. Ha ha ha. But this faith in science can go to extremes, because when scientists argue beyond their data, or when they put down other faiths, because faith in science is a faith just like any other faith, when they comment on other faiths, or when they say this is what the world must be like because science tells me so. Although atheism was always popular among academics, lately it's become fashionable in literary and philosophical circles. Philosopher Dan Dennett and biologist Richard Dawkins wrote books advocating it. Comedian Bill Maher even filmed a movie making fun of religion. Christopher Hitchens, one of the great essayists of the century, died a month ago of esophageal cancer and chronicled his dying in incredibly moving monthly essays. He wrote a book 2 years ago that not only affirmed his own atheism, but pronounced all religions profoundly destructive and demanded that we replace them with science. But unlike Hitchens and many others, I don't think that science will provide answers to all the ultimate questions. The reason is because as the questions get more complicated, so do the answers. If you want to know how the universe began, well, science gave us the Big Bang, which was sort of comprehensible. But now some scientists believe that a big crunch may have preceded the Big Bang, and that string M theory and superstring cosmology may avoid the point particle singularity problems. You see what I mean? That's all gobbledygook to me. I don't understand a word of that. I cribbed it from a UCSB physics website. One physicist has said that the problem with all these theories is that so few people understand them, even in physics. This is the problem. The more we learn in a field, the more specialized the knowledge becomes. There get to be fewer and fewer people who are available who can explain what's found, much less put it together with what everybody else has found. We replace a priesthood who are the only ones who could read Latin with a priesthood who are the only ones that could read the necessary science. In other words, the more we learn, the more distant we become from our knowledge. I'll give you another example from the computer world. About 15 years ago, the chips that power our computers became too complicated for us humans to design. So we developed computers to design the chips that power our computers. We can't understand them anymore. Last year, an IBM supercomputer named Watson defeated the top Jeopardy champions of all time. Watson has now been put to use doing complex medical diagnosis. One day it will be able to solve problems too big for us. One of those problems will probably be how the brain works. As a psychologist, this is something I know a little about. With fancy imaging tools, we can get pretty color pictures of the brain in action. But we still have no earthly idea how our brain knows how to wire itself in development, or how it solves problems, or where consciousness is, or even what consciousness is. The problem is enormously complicated. It's possible that it's too big for us to solve, because the brain is so complex, and we're trying to understand the brain with the same brain. To look at it the other way, if the brain were any simpler, we certainly wouldn't be able to understand it. But what if a Watson-type supercomputer were to figure out how the brain worked? What would happen then? Would it tap us on the shoulder with a spindly titanium finger and try to explain it? And would we be able to understand its explanation? Why would we think the explanation of the brain would be simpler than the brain? So I think it's possible that the answers to the ultimate questions may test the limits of our ability to understand them, even with high-powered science. And that's why I think there'll always be a place for the timeless books and the heroes and the stories and the metaphors in which we place our faith. That's why faith is so comforting, whatever form it takes, because it gives us the answers we crave and the answers we must have. Let me get back to the personal and reel it back from that intellectual stuff and ask you personally, how many of you are scared of dying? Raise your hand. Okay, pretty honest. I'm glad you raised your hand. I'm here to tell you that it gets easier as you get older. I was very scared of death when I was young. I was reared in the Lutheran Church. That doesn't explain it all. In the Lutheran Church, eternal life awaited me after death, whether it was God's grace if I was good, or the fires of hell if I was bad. I remember saying prayers every night that included the verse, "And if I die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." I remember my mom having to reassure me many times that I wouldn't die in my sleep, and at least this helped me get through the night. As we get older, we don't seem to fear death as we did when we were young. The more I approach death, and the more I know people who have faced death, the more I think the question becomes whether we are ready for death. It's true that some people always do rage against the dying of the light, but others, I dare say most, are happy just to let it dim. And that's especially if they live long enough. I have a patient about 65 years of age whose son and daughter have squabbled for years. Recently, they've made up, and both of her children have begun taking her to lunches and dinners every week or so. This woman is overjoyed, and she told me with all seriousness, "I can die now." This phrase, "I can die now," or "I'm ready to go," is surprisingly common. I heard it from an 85-year-old woman when her 35-year-old granddaughter got engaged. And you hear it when people believe their work is done. They've had their careers, they've had their kids and often their grandkids. Things are going pretty well, and now they are ready to let go of life. I think when you were young, you feared death so much because you have had so little of life. When you live life more, you fear death less. In the 55 years from the time my mother reassured me about dying in my sleep to my mother's own deathbed, I learned a great many things about death. Before my mother's death, I witnessed many people die. I learned that in most cases, deaths today are rather peaceful, and that the people surrounding the dying are tested far more than the dying themselves. But my mother's death 2 years ago was what helped me the most not to fear it. She lived in Atlanta near my sister Carol, and I made it out to see her as often as I could in her last year. On one visit, she was still walking, and Carol and I took her to the oncologist appointment, then to her favorite restaurant, and then to Carol's house to rest. Her diagnosis was terminal. The doctor had made this clear, but I took my mother's lead in what we talked about. My mother didn't talk about her cancer or about dying, but with the New York accent that she never managed to lose despite 50 years in the South, she was eager to tell stories about me and my sister when we were young. It seemed like she'd wanted to get these things in while she still had time. Some months later, she had deteriorated and was literally on her deathbed. With some trepidation, I entered her hospital room, slowly approached her death, and I whispered, "Hi, Mom, how are you?" And with an ironic smile that said, "Oh, come on, you stupid idiot," she said, "I'm dying!" Well, I took about 3 steps back, and I tried to recover any hint of poise that I had, and I said, I know, Mom, but how are you? Are you in any pain? Is there anything I can do? I did not know what to say. She stopped me cold, as she always did. But the ice had been broken. She was never in pain despite the advanced cancer, which was a miracle. And while she still had the strength, she kept managing with the humor, that unbelievable New York humor. She gave me a needlepoint that she'd been working on for the previous couple months. She'd remembered Amy's favorite colors. And she was occupied with the details of her upcoming cremation. She was appalled at the prices that the cemetery was charging for the storage of her ashes. $100 for the grout to seal up the urn? Carol, you go to Home Depot. You can get a tube of grout for $2.50. You tell them you're not paying any $100 for any grout. That was my mother. Still later, she was in and out of consciousness, too weak to talk or to feed herself. But my sister and I stayed long hours with her, and when she would wake up or pop back into lucidity, she'd give us a big smile. The last day I was with her, I held her in my arms, and I fed her little bits of ice cream and Jell-O with a spoon. I joked with her that long ago she had spoon-fed me. Now it was my chance to return the favor. She was too weak to speak, but she smiled at that too. Although it was a light-hearted moment, it was an unspeakably deep moment, as I fed and held in my arms this frail woman who 58 years before had given birth to me and cared for me and given me my start in the world. At some point, her breathing simply stopped. She died very simply, without fanfare and without fear. And somehow much of my fear of death died with her. I remember only a deep sadness, and I kept shuttling in my mind around and around between images of her spoon-feeding me and my spoon-feeding her. And then seeing myself in 20 or 30 years, a frail man being cradled and spoon-fed by my wife and my son, and how it has always been this way and will always be this way. I remember a great scene in the movie Blade Runner in which a dying android, played by Rutger Hauer, this is a terrible transition, but I'm getting somewhere here. Talk about running from pain, I'm still doing it. I remember a great scene in the movie Blade Runner in which a dying android played by Rutger Hauer describes a long life of uncanny experiences barely glimpsed by mere mortals, all of which would soon disappear, as he put it, like tears in the rain. They do disappear as he expires. His preset android clock has timed out. For all his experience and the value of his knowledge, there was nothing left. His time had come to nothing. But this is so wrong. And when I began to realize this, I wasn't so sad anymore. In Judaism and other faiths, there's a concept that we achieve immortality in the hearts and memories of others. We are like pebbles that cause lasting ripples in each other's ponds. I wonder if my neighbor and my teachers and friends from 40 and 50 years ago knew the impact they would have on me. I'd like you to think about the people who've had an impact on you. I want you also to appreciate the impact you will have on so many others in your lives. Make it good. And I want to end with some of the major things that make the prospect of my death easier to take. And it's that when I expire, what I was able to learn will not have expired with me. And for that, I must thank you and the others before you that I've been fortunate to know. I've been a teacher for the last 30 years and a parent for nearly 20. During that time, I've had the good fortune to repeat what others have taught me and add a little of what I've learned to some 50,000 students and one son. I hope that this is not my last lecture, but if it is, I would want you to remember this night as one person's attempt to help you navigate through your lives just a little more easily. I've tried to do it with care and concern and an optimism that you will add what you learn and go on to live wonderful, fulfilling lives. And I hope that if one day you are called upon to give a last lecture, that you will do the same for the generation that succeeds you. This has been an incredible honor, and I thank you so much for coming.